begin, what is your specialty in psychology? Can you introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your career, I guess?
Okay. I do research really on families and babies, mothers and babies mostly. So I've been interested a lot in temperament. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept, but the idea that some babies come and they are easily frustrated, for example, and that's really part of their temperament. And then the question becomes, what is it that parents can do to foster the development of those children so that they don't end up, so that they're able to control their frustration or control their fear, things of that sort. So I really deal with a younger population in terms of the focus of my own research.
So then we'll focus on like the 0 to 5. Is that the best?
Sure, although I tend not to approach development in such a stage-oriented way. The way I think about development is that most issues are lifelong, but there are particular times when particular issues sort of come to the fore. So if you're talking about a young baby, you're talking about the attachment, the security of the attachment relationship between the baby and the parents. And if you talk about a child in the second year, you're dealing with autonomy issues and kind of learning to balance the needs of self and other. But that's something that goes through all of life. And as children get older, then they have peer relationships that they're trying to work out, and maybe into adolescence, maybe romantic relationships. So it seems to me that one thing children's literature does is to provide children with some models, some narratives, some stories that help them understand that process for themselves. You know, you have direct experience where something doesn't work out with a friend and you learn something from it, or you might talk with your parents. But books offer very different experiences, and they may help you to make sense of something that happened to you previously, or it may help you to anticipate, you know, what could go on in your own relationships. So I see books and literature sort of broadening experience beyond what you're going to run into in the course of your everyday life. It may be especially important for children who are different from those around them in some ways, to find somebody who's had a similar experience. Or I also think about it in terms of sort of expanding what we know about other people and their experiences. I mean, if you grow up in a middle-class family and it's very comfortable and people are pretty happy, then you may not know very much about people who grow up in poverty and what happens to them. So it's an opportunity to learn, but also not just learn about, but learn what it feels like, learn to empathize with other people. So when I think of children's literature, or literature in general, I think about it in that way, the opportunity to expand experience, both in terms of knowledge and emotional understanding.
Absolutely.
Does that make some sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions we've been asking most of our sources is just, why is reading important? And one of the biggest answers we've been getting back from the majority of people is just that, pretty much what you said, in that it's about learning, going to places that you may not necessarily be able to go, whether that be in like a physical sense, where like that means like, oh, I read a book about Costa Rica, I get to go to Costa Rica, but I live in Vermont.
Yeah.
But it's also in a sense of mentality, like, you know, I can see what it's like to be a girl,
Right.
if you're a boy,
Right.
or, you know,
To empathize, to understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what we want to learn about is when a child is very young, what happens if they don't learn to read? What does that do to the brain?
Well, I don't know a lot about brain development. If a child doesn't learn to read, then they're deprived of that way of knowing about the world. Now, there are lots of other ways. I mean, you can use film, you can listen to books on tape, so you don't absolutely have to read. But certainly, if you don't read, then you're limited again. The sources of your information about the world are limited. So I'm not entirely sure what you mean in terms of brain development.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly a child who's learning to read is forging certain kinds of connections in the brain. Whether there is any kind of a sensitive period for learning to read, I'm not sure that we know that yet. I mean, children tend to learn at a particular age, but people have certainly learned to read when they're much older. So my guess is it's one of those lifelong skills that you can learn at any time.
So you were saying that you specialize in this, in the mother-child relationship. How does a child, their stages of development, not necessarily ages, but stages of what a child goes through within their first few years of life, can you explain to us the different stages that they go through? Like when you were kind of saying how at one point they're working on the relationship with their mother, and then at one point they're peers, and then the having a physical relationship with someone. Can you explain to us in more detail what those stages are?
In terms of stages of development? Well, I mean, that's really a huge question. It's all of developmental psychology. So when we talk about, are you familiar with the concept of attachment?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there is the idea, and it seems to be reasonably well established, that during the first year of life, babies begin to form specific emotional attachments to specific others. Now, we used to think that it just happened in infancy, and that what happened in infancy predicted to what happened later on. In fact, we now know that the quality of the relationships that infants develop, the attachment relationships, they begin to develop early, but they change over time, and they are probably formed all the way through childhood and adolescence, with children either changing their relationships with their parents as the parents themselves change, or continuing them. So it's not, at least in terms of considering the security of attachment, it's not something that is formed once and for all early on, and if it doesn't happen, then it's not going to happen. There are certain aspects of development that seem to be related to critical or sensitive periods, but they tend to be sort of basic characteristics of human beings. So, for example, if you're not exposed to any language at all, you may not develop the ability to use language later on. But how many children are totally deprived of any language experience? It doesn't happen very frequently. So that genetically we are built predisposed to be able to learn language, but all we have to have is sort of the minimal exposure in our environment, okay, in order for that to develop. And if we didn't get it, if we didn't get that minimal kind of experience, then there would invariably be problems later on. Okay. In most other aspects of development, other than these basic, that's just one example of them, but just in terms like the quality of our relationships, that's something that develops over a much longer period of time, and even into adulthood. People who've had bad experiences with parents, who have insecure relationship, can develop a different view of the world and themselves by virtue of interacting with a loving partner. So the possibility for growth and development is almost endless. On the other hand, if a child develops an insecure relationship with a parent, and it doesn't get changed in some way, okay, then that can spill over and gets carried over into other relationships. So when I say insecure, let's say a child learns that they can't count on the parent, that that they're not going to get what they need, or they're only going to get it if they really have a tantrum and control it, okay? So if that relationship doesn't change, then the child has learned something about the world and will carry it into relationships with other adults and find that causes problems. Teachers don't like that kind of behavior. Peers don't like that kind of behavior. But it's not inevitable. I mean, that's what we're learning in developmental psychology, that the possibility exists for change. It may be hard, though, because a child who has developed those characteristics is not very pleasant to be around. And so it requires some effort on the part of the parents or the other adults or the community in order to make that change happen.
Can that relationship ness, I don't even know what to call it, but the relationship with another being, could that same sort of relationship exist with kids and books and getting kids to read and that love of books? I mean, there are obviously some kids who are reluctant readers, they don't like reading, and there are other kids who will read anything they can find. Do you think you could, do you think that it's a possibility that kids develop that same relationship and have that same